You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. During each bi-monthly episode, we'll be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic. I'm your host, Hailey Kerstetter, and my guest today is Dr. Kimberly Cole, professor and equine extension specialist at The Ohio State University. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Cole.
Thanks for inviting me.
So we're going to jump right in, and this is a very relatable topic for me today. When we're recording this, we just got several inches of snow and ice last night in Pennsylvania. So this episode about managing snow and ice on horse farms is very important. I just went out to feed my horses lunch and dealt with a lot of snow and ice. So when we jump in, I'm hoping you can tell me a bit about what some of the problems or dangers that snow and ice could cause on horse farms.
Sure. Yeah. Very timely. I probably spent double the amount of time I normally do doing chores in the morning at the farm just because of all the snow and ice that we've had and the cold temperatures. The main concerns that we have are actually injuries to both people and horses caused by slipping and falling. Not only are areas slippery, especially our pathways that we travel a lot, can get very slippery. But when the ground freezes and we've had ruts, that also makes walking really hard to do because we have the lows and the highs. And then when we're out there and the horses are out there walking, if it's not flat, we're trying to walk on the highs. So it's really easy for us to twist an ankle or for a horse to bruise its soles. One of the other issues that we've had that not all horses deal with, and it seems like not every snow we have to worry about it, but the snowballs or ice balls that form in the bottom of their hoof over time, and it's kind of like they're walking on that snowball. We see those happening in both barefoot horses and those that are wearing shoes. But we can see it sometimes more often in horses that are wearing shoes. It's like the snow packs in there and then their warmth melts it and then it refreezes. So that can be problematic. So we can try and prevent it sometimes. Farriers might be able to add pads when they shoe a horse if they know that that's going to be an issue. I've seen a lot of people trying to use those hoof boots that are made by various manufacturers because it makes a solid surface so it can't pack up in there. And then I've even tried myself some of those things that we might see on social media, like cooking spray or Vaseline or Crisco. But none of them I found for myself, at least, have worked really well consistently. So usually making sure I take a hoof pick out there with me for those that are staying outside and trying to pick those out as best as possible. Some of the other things that we don't think about sometimes are our rooftops have certain snow loads. So if we get a really big snow and our shelters or our barns aren't meant for that, we might see partial or full collapse of the roof. And then the snow and ice falling from those can also block doorways or pathways. So I've run into that sometimes where it's fine, but then a big chunk of it will fall off and then block a doorway. And then I can't get a sliding door shut or I can't get a hinge door shut. And then probably our least favorite is the mud when all the snow and ice starts to melt. So those are the main things that at least I've run into in working with horses in this weather.
Yeah, I think everything you've mentioned are things I've dealt with at least in the last couple of days. I have a gelding who I board, and he's a typical goofy gelding, doesn't pay attention half the time to what he's doing, and we were walking down the hill, and I noticed he started slipping a little. I'm like, okay, hey, pay attention. You kind of have to force them to focus on where they're going and what they're doing.
Yeah, it's the slipping, especially with, if they're in a hurry or if there's multiple ones in there, it can make it somewhat treacherous. Funny, but somewhat treacherous too.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a follow-up question to that about the ice. So do you ever put down salt once ice is already formed? Do you put down salt and is it safe for other animals? Like, for example, my dog comes to the barn with me, and that's something I always worry about with her is if the salt's okay or if it could burn another animal's feet or something like that.
Yeah, some of the salt or the snow melt stuff is can irritate their pads also if they ingest it. But I think there are some products on the market that are supposed to be safe for animals. One thing that I found that works okay, sand doesn't work as well. It just seems to get brushed off, but I've used sand and then cat litter sometimes. It has some absorption in it. And I've used that in areas. And I found that really well. Plus, they make the uh, carriers a lot easier within the plastic jugs or the boxes with the handles on them. So a lot easier to pick up. So I've usually used that in mainly the human pathway areas so people aren't slipping as they're walking back and forth and as they come and go. So I've usually had cat litter on hand.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. We actually recently got cats, so I might have to try that. So going back to some of the problems that come with snow and ice, what health issues can extreme cold temperatures cause in horses? Is there anything that we should be looking out for when we're out in the barn?
Yeah, this time of year, when it gets super cold like this, even without snow and ice, we run into problems with dehydration and colic. So it's kind of a double whammy. Uh, the horses often drink less when the water is really cold or frozen and not available, and we have to break the ice off. If we don't use electric heated buckets or tank de-icers. But we add or compound to that because we know that they need more energy to help stay warm. So we often give them more hay to generate that heat. So they're drinking less water, but we're adding more dry matter in that hay. So that is a lot less moisture in their GI tract. So we tend to see more colics, obstructions and things like that. And one of the things that I try and do is many of our commercial feeds nowadays are in the form of pellets, and then hay pellets as well. They are super easy to soak. So in the winter, I often will add some warm water to any hay or grain pellets that I'm going to feed and let them soak just for 5 to 10 minutes before feeding them. And that water helps expand the pellet. So then that's less moisture I'm pulling from their GI tract because I know they're probably drinking a little bit less. I try and pay really close attention to their water buckets. Some horses we've got on automatic water, so that makes it a little tough. But if I've got sink automatic or where I put manually filling the buckets, I try and keep an eye on that more so than normal. Some people will say to add salt to the horse's water. Each horse is a little bit different. Some might be really picky about that. Some might not. Different electrolytes and things like that to encourage them to drink. But one of the ways that I try and help with that is just adding water to what I feed. I don't change their feed. I just add water to what I am feeding them.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We get a lot of questions about bran mash in the winter, and all of the nutritionists that we work with, do not recommend a bran mash. But multiple of them have said, if you already feed hay pellets or cubes, you can add a little extra water there, or even just soaking their normal feed. And I've actually implemented that for my own horses because I'm totally paranoid about their water intake, really all the time, but especially during the winter. So I think that's such a good tip that more people should utilize.
Yeah, definitely no to bran mashes because you don't want to change their diet. And it's just become a routine thing that I've done. Is just I add water to their grain and let it sit, and they have no problem eating that up. And It's just a little bit, it's not going to prevent everything, but at least I know they're getting some water in when they're less likely to drink.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in cases where you know that snow or ice is coming, what can you do to prevent it from forming on your farm, if anything? I know when it's this cold, it's really hard to do that.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Probably a lot of what can be done actually is done I try and do it during the warmer months if I can remember and don't get caught up with other things. One of the things that I found that helps the most is keeping those areas that are going to get a lot of traffic um, as graded as possible so that either they are level or have a slight slope. Because I find that those areas that have a little bit of a dip in them that are heavily traveled, which is no big deal when there's no snow or ice on there. But when it gets wet and then the water puddles there and then it freezes, those are the places, especially when there's fresh snow on top of a slippery spot underneath. That's always a challenge. But by the time that there's snow and ice on the ground's usually too hard to do anything with. So I try and remember in the fall, looking at the different areas and grading them as much as possible. That might mean adding some more of whatever footing is there, if it's gravel, topsoil. I've seen a lot of people use the varying grid systems for their high traffic areas. Uh, I've had some friends swear by them and absolutely love them, but I know I've had others that say they don't help. But I think a lot of that help or makes a difference when the groundwork, that foundation is being laid, if they really put them in properly instead of just laying them on top of whatever's there. So a few different things can be done. Unfortunately, not a whole lot, but it seems like the best things to do are when it's actually warmer and you can move the ground when it hasn't frozen yet.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's basically impossible to move the ground right now, at least where I am. It's so cold.
Yeah, and it's frozen. I've broken a couple of shovel handles already
Oh
and
gosh.
trying to dig a few things out and where the ground's frozen and then, yeah. So it doesn't work quite as well once the ground's frozen.
Even under the best circumstances, travel is stressful for horses. We've all been there, stuck on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. You can make the journey knowing that US Rider is there for you. Get peace of mind on the road with US Rider's nationwide 24/7 roadside assistance coverage for both you and your horse. Join today at usrider.org.
So we very briefly mentioned salt products, but what are the best ways to remove ice when it does form? And if there are any that are also safe for other animals, I'm sure people would love to hear that because where there are horse people, there are usually also cats and dogs.
Yep. Usually sand or the pet safe snow melts. I think there are a few on the market for those, just so it's not necessarily the ingestion as much sometimes, but when they get it on their paws or the pads, it can irritate them and then they lick their pads and kind of making it worse. But removing the ice, it just kind of depends on how much that they're looking at, whether it's a few inches. Once it starts to compact, it can be really problematic to get to, or it refreezes really quickly. I've seen a lot of people put down different types of, not really carpets, but rugs or mats or indoor outdoor carpets on different areas, having a foot brush where you can brush your feet off, just so where we kind of before we go into a building or when we step out, the moisture when it melts right inside the entrance, that can then refreeze and be a slippery spot. So throwing those down and then cleaning them or replacing them throughout the day. Just kind of varies. For our ice around the farm, I think horse owners have lots of neat tricks, whether it's a frozen snap that, you don't want to bang it right away, because then a lot of times it'll break the snap if it's one of the spring release ones. So holding it, cupping it in your hand and blowing a few hot breaths on that. I was doing that this morning on a couple of snaps that were broken or were frozen. I usually carry some type of a hammer with me, or a crowbar for that, or a rubber mallet, depending on what you're trying to remove. But also not dumping ice in a place that's going to melt and be a problem. Sometimes when we dump buckets and dump the ice out, we do it at the quickest place, but then that can become a problem when it then melts and then refreezes on a slightly warm day. So trying to get rid of it is really tough.
Yeah, I'm going to give away her secrets for a minute, but our web producer Jennifer, she shared with us a really cool tip, I thought, for buckets that are maybe not fully frozen over, but they have ice floating in it, or say you've broken the ice on the top, but there's ice floating in it. I don't know about your horses, but mine really won't drink it if there's still big chunks of ice in there. So she said she'll take like a big sifter or a strainer and run it over the top to grab all those ice chunks so you don't have to get your hands super cold, which I thought was awesome because I always, will stick my hands in there and then they're freezing cold and I'm trying to warm them up. So that was like a perfect little solution that I never would have thought of.
I love that idea, and I do that, and I found, so I used to try and use the handle as the hammer, but on some of the sifters, they're kind of mesh and they dent really easily.
Yeah.
So I found, plus they have short handles. So I found, and it's either at like a local box store, you can get it online. It's a strainer, but it's all metal. It's spiral, but it's got a long handle. I think it's meant for pasta, but it's about 4 inches wide. It works great because I can use the handle and break it up, swirl it around, flip it over, and go all the way down in the bucket without having to dip my fingers with my gloves on in there. They work wonders.
Oh, that's perfect.
And they're a lot sturdier. The metal ones are a lot sturdier than the metal mesh ones. They'll hold more ice.
Yeah, that's good to know. I'm definitely going to have to try that one out. So moving to turnout in these conditions, because this is something that we're actively dealing with right now, is whether or not it's really safe to turn out in poor conditions. So how would you say is the best way for barn managers to decide if it's unsafe to turn their horses out when there's snow and or ice?
Great question. It really depends on the horse, because sometimes, unfortunately for us, they make poor choices for that. So is it a horse that, well, first and foremost, we're turning them out. Some horses are out 24/7. So, kind of thinking along the lines, do they have shelter even if we're turning out for a little bit while we're cleaning stalls or letting them move around? Is there shelter if need be? And then, what are those pathways like? Are they slippery getting there? Is the turnout area okay, but getting there is a little challenging? What's the ground like? Is it bumpy, flat? Is it icy? Is the horse going out by itself or with others? Is it one? How does it act? Is it going to kind of use good judgment and walk around, or is it going to get out there and run around and, practice a sliding stop that it's never ever done, or, something to make us cringe or worry about? Well, that's going to be really expensive and take a long time to heal. So it really depends. Are they wearing shoes? Some of those types of things. I kind of base it more on the individual horse. Even horses that I turn out together, I might try and turn them out by themselves. So that way, if they are feeling a little bit frisky, maybe not to encourage them, but then you might have the horse who becomes nervous or anxious if they're by themselves. So it really kind of depends on, some of those things, who's going to be around them in terms of if they have turnout buddies, or how are they going in and out, how long has it been since they've been out, because even the nice some horses are just going out, and as soon as they get in the arena or turnout area, even if it's covered in snow, they're going to roll and itch, and you know other concerns like that. Also, the process of getting them out there. Sometimes you have horses that may not be able to go out, and then by turning others out, how much does that make them become anxious or upset when some horses are going out and others aren't? Just kind of depends on the whole dynamic of who's at the farm.
Yeah, for sure. And when barn managers are preparing for a larger storm, and especially people who maybe have a bigger barn where they have employees who don't live on site, how could the manager prepare for a situation where the employees might not be able to get to the barn, and say you are one person trying to manage 20, 30 plus horses on your own?
Make sure that you have nothing else to do that day, because it's going to take more time. I think for me, with my horses at home and knowing that it's going to take longer or potentially take longer, is I try and have things prepared as much as possible, whether that's, mixing up a ration and putting it in a bucket that's ready for the next, something that's covered, ready for the next feeding, all sorts of different things. But I like to have extra hay and extra water on hand. So whether that's empty buckets that I can, or empty bottles, sometimes I'll save gallon jugs and rinse those out, things to make it a little bit easier to carry, just so I'm making less trips. Some of the things that I've done, my cart that I have that's super great to pull through the barn from outside when it's flat and smooth, works wonderful, but it doesn't pull so well in the snow. The snow gets in the tires or they freeze, and it's more work. So I got a sled. So one of those little inexpensive plastic sleds that I can put a bale of hay on and slide down the barn aisle if my cart's not working. Little things like that, just to try and make it easier for me. But extra buckets of water, depending on if I've got a heated area in the barn where I can leave buckets easy to change out. So instead of having to break ice, I can just put a new bucket in and then take the old bucket out and let it thaw. Sometimes that might save you some time and some labor for chipping out ice out of a bucket. Kind of just depends on what I'm doing, but I always try and have stuff as set up in advance as I can. Am I going to be able to do turnout? Whereas, is that going to take me longer time? Then if you put blankets on, if you clean the stalls, all of those things, how can I make it a little bit more efficient, being one person, so it doesn't take, by the time you finish one feeding, it's time to go back and do the next one.
Definitely. And unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So I have one more question for you. And I ask all of my guests this about their respective topic. So my question for you is, what is the most common misconception that you hear about snow and ice on horse farms?
I don't really hear anything about ice. But often I hear, well, if the horse has snow, then they can, they've got plenty of water, or that they'll lick through the ice to get to the water. Not all animals will, some will, but they would have to consume quite a bit of snow to make up the same amount in water. And the other myth I'd probably say is that when you see the videos of people riding their horses in the snow, or doing the skijoring or sledding behind them, I always am envious, because I don't usually, the snow and the ice means more work and less playtime. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, definitely. I know some people who love to go for like bareback rides in the snow. They'll like leave the horses' blankets on and just hop on and go for a walkabout. And I'm like, that's not me. It's taking me longer to do my barn work, and I don't want to be out here any longer than I have to.
Exactly. Usually I'm in coveralls that there's no way I could even think. I mean, it's hard enough to bend over sometimes in them
Yeah.
because like they always seem to be a few inches too long in the torso area. So it's hard enough to do work in them. I couldn't imagine trying to hop up on a horse in them.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but it's been really fun talking with you today, Dr. Cole, if you can make snow and ice fun, I guess.
Well, thanks for having me. I had a great time.
Thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management Podcast to a friend.